In this session, we're going to start with the introduction with JavaScript Basics. So we've looked at HTML, we've looked at CSS, and now at this point, we're ready to dive into the JavaScript. Let me just put this in presentation mode. And so we start with the introduction of JavaScript, what it is used for, how we can use it with website creation, and we then discuss things like data types, if statements, and loops, and some exercises. And then you can then refer to the reference guide for more learning. So JavaScript is an interpreted language used to make websites. What this means by interpreted is that when we write our JavaScript in our editor, when the machine is trying to read the JavaScript, it doesn't have to compile it to machine code. That is a series of zeros and ones. It just understands it from the way we've written it in our editor. So that's what it means by an interpreted language. And this is one of the languages that we use to make websites. And then JavaScript can run in any browser. So we've got the Chrome, Firefox, IE, Safari, etc. JavaScript can run in any of those browsers, which is great. So some of the applications and websites that we've used to that JavaScript has been used to create, that's one of the languages. Are web applications like Google Maps, Netflix, which is what most people might be familiar with. It can also be used to do some applications on smartwatches and then games like Minecraft. So if you might be wondering what's the difference between a web application and a website, so a website is just normally like a static page where people just go and read things, while web applications are more interactive. So the users might be doing things like signing up or like liking stuff, or even posting their own content onto there. So web applications like Facebook, for example, can be one of those examples. And so let's now first start off with one of the very important things with JavaScript and any other programming languages. They all have things called variables that are like boxes in the memory in our computer that store data that we as developers might want to retrieve at some time during our coding. And so if you think about variables as these boxes here, you can say that if you wanted to store like a string inside a variable, so a string is like any word. In this case, I've written my name inside the quotes, so that is a string. And then I want to store that string inside somewhere in our computer. And so in order to do that, I've declared a variable. So this is an example of declaring a variable. And I've used a keyword called var, which is a type that we can use to declare our variable. And we said a var name, so we can say anything we want here. So we can call this anything we want. It could be var name, var first name, whatever we want to call it there. It doesn't have to be name. And then we can then pass in the string, and so automatically this variable now becomes a type of string. And then we close that with our semicolon here. And then we have another keyword for declaring variables called let. So by using let, we can then say name our variable another thing, age in this case, or number, whatever we want to name it. And then we then assign the value 100 by saying equals to 100. And so that 100 is an integer, and so that automatically the type of variable here now automatically becomes an integer. And then we have the final keyword here, which is const. And then this keyword const has a variable name called height. We can name it whatever we want, and we've passed in a string as well. So in this case, where we have this string as well, and we've gotten these three ways of declaring our variables, you might be asking, what's now the difference between the var, the let, and the const? Let's quickly go over our editor, and then for me to explain what the difference between these three is and when it will be advisable for you to use it and not use it. Now that we are trying to differentiate between the difference between let, var, and const, let's first put this in a comment here and say var, and then here we have let, and here we have const. So var is what we say has something called, or it is confined within something called a function scope. And then let is confined between something we call a block scope, and then const has the same property of being confined to a block scope as well. So let's first look at what the difference between the var and the let is before we then compare it to the const. So between var and let, when we say something is confined to a function scope, it just means that whatever you declare as a variable in a function, so a function is something we're going to look at as we're going along, whatever you declare as a function or whatever variable you declare inside a function, you can be able to access this value any other place inside that function. While for let, it is confined by these two things called curly brackets. So if you declared like a let variable inside these two curly brackets and you try to access that variable outside of the curly bracket, it would not know what it is anymore because it's not inside of here. So your let variable is only declared when you declare it inside the curly bracket, you can only access it inside that curly bracket and not outside of it. So for example, when we have a for loop or when we have an if statement, which we're also going to look at as in this lesson that we're taking right now. And so another thing to have in mind as well is for var, when you declare a var variable inside your file, after you declare it, you can access the value before you declared it. So for example, if I have var name and I say equals to Omotola here, and then I try to access that variable before I declared it with var, so if I say console log name here, with var, you can see that it does not throw me any error at all. It just stays there that way. It doesn't know about it, but it doesn't throw me any error anyways. But then if I do the same thing, if I do the same declaration with using a let keyword instead, and I say let age, for example, and then I give this a number and I say 90, and then I try to access the variable age before the declaration that I just did here. So if I just take this and I come here and I say age, you can see that immediately an error is shown and says we do not know. A reference error is shown and says we don't know anything about age because I'm trying to access it before I declared it. So with the var keyword, it allows us to do careless things like this, but with the let keyword, it makes sure that we are not making such mistakes by trying to access our variable or trying to reference our variable before we declare them. So this is another difference that you should take note of. All right. So later on, we're going to be looking at the function, and when we look at that function, I'm going to further then explain this whole concept of block scope and function scope. But for now, just know that any variable that you define in a function, you can access anywhere in that function, but then the let keyword is really confined to this curly brackets. So now let's then compare these to the const keyword. So the const keyword is also block scoped as well, and it has similar attributes as the let keyword, but then the only difference is that when you declare a variable with a const, let's just say pi for example, and we'll say pi is 3.47. If we then try to reassign the variable of pi to something else, let's just say 78, we're going to get an error thrown that says that we cannot change the value to another value. So whenever you're using a constant, you have to be sure that the constant variable does not change. If not, you're not going to be able to use it again. So when it then comes to which one should be better to use in the case of either using a var, a let, or a const, most people will say use a let so that it does not introduce errors into your code, because with the var, it's very easy to introduce errors because you might declare something and then be accessing somewhere else, and you're not quite sure where your error is coming from. So when we use let, it just kind of reduces the risk of having bugs that are very, very hard to find in our code. So let helps us in that way. And then with constants, you can use constants as well, but then in just situations that you know that that variable that you've assigned to the constant does not change. So that's really where you can then decide which ones to use when you're doing your own code. Let's then proceed to looking at other types in JavaScript. So the other types in JavaScript that we have is we've got them in two categories. We've got the primitive types and we've got the reference types. And so the primitive types are made up of numbers, strings, which we've looked at, booleans, null, and undefined. And then the reference types are some examples of that are objects, functions, and arrays. So we're going to be looking at some of these types during this class as well. So let's get back to our coding playground, and then let's kind of play with some of the types that we just talked about now. Exercise, we can see that it's asking us to create a string and assign it a value, create an integer and assign it an age, create a float as well, which is a type of integer, and then a boolean value, and then concatenate it or then do some interpolation with it. So these are just two ways of joining a string. So let's be showing an example of what we are going to be creating in our JavaScript. So because we said using let is a better option, let us declare a variable and say let name equals to Omotola, and then let age equals to 90. And then the next thing that it says we should do is we should also create a float and assign it a height. So a float is like a decimal number, so let's just call this height, and we'll say the height is 5.4. Close that as well. And so the next thing that it says is also create a boolean value and then assign this true or false, and let's put that in there and say let as well. Let's say it's married, for example, and we'll say false. So the boolean values can either be true or false, and in this case we've given it the value false. Normally our variables here should have some sort of descriptive name that helps us kind of know what they hold. It's just really good for people when you're reading your code, or for other people that might be trying to check exactly what your code is doing at a particular point in time. And so it also asks us to concatenate our string by writing a greeting. So we can do concatenate, or we can add strings together. That's what it means by concatenating. We can do that in two ways, either by concatenation itself, or we can do it by interpolation. Don't worry about what the names mean, just focus more on what it does. So here let's put out a greeting. Let's console log this. So if we console.log, which shows us what we're doing in this terminal here, we can put that in a string, hi, and say my name is, and then with concatenation we do plus, and then a space, and then another plus, and then we can add the name variable which we had here, and you can see here we have my name is Omotola because I've added the variable there. And then we can also say plus. So if we want to add the strings together, we have to put that plus there. Plus I want to say I am 90, sorry, not 90 there, with the age 90, and then plus years old, for example, years old. Okay, and this is how it looks. Let me just bring this way so we can see what I'm doing here. And you can see that I was able to write, hi, my name is Omotola, I am 90 years old. Let's just put a space there, which we have, and then another space between the 90, which we don't have in this case. So this is how you do it with using interpolation, using concatenation. So if we're to use interpolation to do the same thing, what we can do here, instead of having this pluses, is let's let's do another console log at the bottom here. You can say console.log, and we can then say, or using the backticks. So if you look for the slanted apostrophes in your keyboard, you should find it. And when you find it, you can just say, hi, my name is, and then you have the $sign, and then opening and closing brackets, and then you put in name in between there. And you can see that I was able to print out the same variables as well. So this is just using interpolation to do the same thing. And the first one is using concatenation. And so this is just really the difference between these two things. You can add more things to it as well, and then you can just keep on writing comma I am, and then you can put the dollar for the next one. I am age 90 years old, and it just continues like that if you want. So that's how to do that, and we've looked at some of the other types of primitive data types in JavaScript. Moving on. Now we're moving on to the reference types, and the first reference type we're going to be taking a look at is the arrays reference type. So with arrays, we've seen how variables can just store one value, but with arrays, what happens here is that we're able to store multiple values in like boxes here that have an index of 0 to how long that array is. So each value that we store in our array is indexed, and the index starts from 0, and then if you have another value, it goes to 1, and if you have another value, it goes to 2, until whatever number of data that we want to store in our array. If that's 10, then our array's length is 10. If it's 20, then our array's length is 20. So if we then want to also access the value in our array, we can do this by accessing it by calling the name of the variable, and then square brackets, and then the index of that value. In this case, we would have 8 here, and whatever is stored at index 8 is going to then be printed to us. Now let's just do a quick example. Here it says to create an array of states in Nigeria. So if we come to our play code ground, and then we say, let's take all of this out, and then we declare an array, and here we say we want to call it states, and we say square brackets. So this is how we declare an array. This square brackets, opening and close brackets, says that the states in here is a type of array, or it's an array, not a type of array. And so we can save in this array multiple types of values if we want. So I think in this case here, we can see that we have numbers, strings, we have Boolean, and we even have an object here as well. But then in this array, it says to store a value of states, which we're going to be storing strings in this array. So in that case, we're only going to be storing one type of data in this array. So in order to do that, we can just come here and say, okay, the first state we want to store in there is Abuja, the next one is Lagos, and then the next one is Jos, and then the next one is Enugu, and then finally let's put in Kano there. Okay, so we saved in all these values in our states array. And so if we then it says to console log the array to see if that has worked. So let's see what's then showing in our console log of this array. So if we console log states, you can see that it's giving us an array of Abuja, Lagos, Jos, Enugu, and Kano. Let's see what the next thing is here. It says add a new state to the end of the array. But before we add a new state to the end of the array, let us access a value in the index of one of these strings here. So in order to do this, remember what we said, it starts from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. We can come in here and say 0, and at 0 you see we have Abuja, the value Abuja, and then if we come in here 1, we can see we have Lagos, 2, Jos, 4, Kano, which is the last one. If you try to do 5, It will say undefined because we don't have a value at 5. So therefore, the value that we're requesting does not exist. That's why it says undefined here. All right, since now that we know that, it says what our exercise is saying is that we should add a new state to the end of the array. And in order to do this in JavaScript comes with very many helpful functions for us. And all we just have to do is come here and say states and then dot push. And this is an inbuilt function. And so with this function here, I can say I want to push in a new value and say I want to give it the value of email. And so now that I have that value there, you can see that our console log has a fifth indexed value here. And so before where we tried to access it, we didn't have anything. If we do 5 now, you can see that now has the state of email. So we've added something. Now how can we remove the first state in the array? So to remove the first state in the array, we can say that we could come here and say states dot shift, which takes out the first index in this array, which was Abuja before, but because I called shift on this array, it's taking the first value, which was Abuja. And now the next thing that it says we should do is remove the last state in the array, which is in this case, because we've added email, so that's the last one instead of Kano. So we're going to remove emo now, which is pop. So that has now removed emo from our states, and this is now the current state of this array, which is what is printed here. And then it says insert the country in the middle of the array. I think what this meant was, okay, so the country of the states in this array. So if we come here, how do we know what the middle is? Right now we have Lagos, Jos, Enugu, and Kano. So in order to know what the middle is, what we can do is declare another variable that says middle. So let middle equals to states. We have another property of arrays that's called length that tells us what the length of the array is. So if we console log this, we can see that the length of the array will be 4. So if we go console log, say middle, you can see that the length of the array is 4, which is correct. So in order to then determine where the middle is, we can then divide, we can then say that, okay, to assign a value at the middle, we can say middle divided by 2. Okay, let's not do it that way because it's going to be a bit messy. Let's say we want to get the index. Let's get the index middle here. Sorry, we call this index, and then we say equals to middle divided by 2, right? Just to get the middle. And so if we console log this to see what that value is, you can say index, and you can see that has given us a full number. But let's just say we had, let's push another value in here, and we didn't have a complete number, we had a decimal. What happens in that case? Let's push in let's say Quora, for example, and we have that, and then you can see that our index now is 2.5, and because the indexes are not in fractions and in whole numbers, we need to pass this to a whole integer in order to get where the middle of this array is. So in that case, we're going to do something here called parse int, which is another inbuilt function that takes in a value of index. And now you can see that it was 2.5 before, but now we have 2 as that whole number. And so in this case now, we can then, or let's create another variable and say whole number called that way, and then we assign it this value called parse int index, and we put it here. And so we can see that has a whole number there, and we can then assign this country to the middle. And how we do this, how we add a new value to our array, is by saying states and then we get the index, which is whole number. So we've now said that the middle of this is at index 2, and then we then say equals to Nigeria. So you can see that that has then become the middle of our array, where we have 2 on this side and 2 on this side. So we put the value in the middle. And so this is so you can do other things like joins, etc., and all of the other things that you might want to practice with arrays, because it has a lot of functions that you can use with arrays that are already pre-built into how JavaScript works. Let's like join 2 arrays. What we can do here is, let's say we create another array of more states. Okay, we've got an array of more states there, and so we want to join this more states array with the original states arrays that is there. So how do we do this? Let's say we join this and then put it inside a new put it inside a new variable called let new states, small letter, and then we can then say states, that's the first state dot concat, which is a built-in function, more states, oops. And then now if we then console.log new states, you can see that our new states has Lagos, it has Lagos, Jos, Nigeria, Kano, Kwara, Katsina, Port Harcourt, and Ogun, which is this thing. So if you wanted to join 2 arrays together, this is how you do it. It doesn't matter if more states comes before states, it's just take one array and then join it to another array. That's what this does. And so I think someone asked me, how do we remove a value in the middle of our array? And so we can see that we have added Nigeria at the middle. And so if we wanted to take Nigeria out of this middle, and we know that the index here is this middle, how we can do this now is, if you just like watch this array here, if you come here now and then you say states, which is the array that currently holds that array there, and we say dot splice. So splice is a function, and this takes 3 parameters. The first parameter is the index that you want to do something on. So in this case, we want to do something at index whole number, which is index we had it there as index 2. So if we console log this here, this was console.log whole number, which we had there as index 2. Let's just take out this middle here, we don't need it anymore. And so the second parameter now is then says do something to a certain number of elements in the, a certain number of values in your array. So right now I just wanted to delete one value in my array, and so if I put 1 there, you can see that it's taking away Nigeria and it's left to 2, the other ones as well. If, for example, I wanted to add more things after I finish deleting what I've deleted, then I can come here and say, okay, add something like, I want to add another state like Kwara, and then another comma, and then I can add another state here like and another state like Bayelsa here. And so you can see that it's just adding it after that index. So after whole number here, if I didn't want to delete anything, I can just put here 0 and it doesn't delete anything. And you can see that here we have Nigeria still there, but at that index I said I wanted to delete Nigeria, so that's why that went away. And so after that index, I then want to add things like Wara, Bayelsa, etc. So this is how you work with some of the functions with arrays. At this point now, we're going to be looking at if statements in JavaScript. And with if statements, how it works is you have a keyword if, and then if a condition is true between the opening bracket and the closing bracket, we want it to execute this block of code. Else, if it's false, we want it to execute this block of code. And so this is just how it works. So this condition always has to either, the result of the condition here always have to be either true or false. It cannot be any other thing. And so right here is when we see where we're using things like booleans to do it, or other operators I'm going to show you in a bit. Now it says write an if statement that checks if a condition is true, and then console log the response depending on the condition. So if we go back to play code, and then we just take out everything that we've written here up until those states here, and you can see here that we have this value called is married. If we are to then use an if statement to say something about that, we say if is married, which holds the value false, you can then console log this condition is true, or else here we can just say console log this condition is false, which is the case here because because the value of is married here is false. So therefore when it checks it here, because that is not true, then it's going to come to this second part, and then it's going to console log the value that is there. But if we change this to true, you can see that it has changed to this condition is true. Other things that we can do to check if the result is going to be evaluated to true or false is using operators like equal, like greater than equals to, like less than equals to, greater than, less than, and then not equals to. So normally these conditions you can evaluate them using strings or numbers. So here I can compare two strings, for example, and say if name, for example, if name is equals to Omotola, then you say this condition is true. Even if I say if name is Omotola like that, this becomes false because it is case sensitive, because this is not a big O and that was a big O. That means the value here is not equals to this value. But then if I said if it's not equals to here, you can see that because it's not equals to, which is true, this condition here is then executed. Why don't we try this with numbers? And I've got if age is greater than or equals to 90, which I have here. So in this case, age is equals to 90, so it comes here and says what it needs to say. But then, for example, if we had age 80 here, age is still greater than 80, so it says here if we have 100, it then becomes false. If we put less than equals to, if you put 90 there, it's still going to do the first condition because age is equals to 90. But then if we say that we wanted to put something like if age is 50, for example, this 90 is not less than 50, so therefore the condition is false, and that is why we are here. So if you didn't want to use the equals to there, you can just put it like that, and then that condition of equals to. So for example, if I then put 90 here, 90 is not less than 90, so we have the false. If we put that as greater than, it's not greater than either, and then we have the false as well. So taking all of these operators into consideration, we can then use it in our if statement. So what else is there again to look at? So we looked at if statements, and now let's take a look at loops in JavaScript. In JavaScript, there are two types of loops. We've got the for loops and then the while loop. The only difference between these two loops is that with the for loop, sometimes you know exactly how long it's going to run for. But for a while loop, you're not quite sure how long the loop is going to keep on going. So whenever you're unsure how long a loop is going to keep on iterating, you can use a while loop. But for a for loop, you can use it when you're sure that, okay, but by when it reaches this end, then this is going to stop. So I'm going to show you an example of how to use both of these things. And it says here, this exercise says, create a for loop and console log the output counting down from 0 up to 10. And then create an array and loop through that as well. So let's first do the first one, where we want to count to 10. So for loop, which is a keyword for, and then we declare the variable inside. We say let I equals to 0, and then I, which is the condition, if I is less than 10, because we're counting up to 10, then we say I plus plus, which is the same thing as saying I equals to I plus 1. And then inside this console log here, we can then put I. And you can see that this for loop has gone 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and up till 9. Because we started with 0. If we wanted to get to 10, we can start with 1. And then you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 as well. If we said if I is less than equals to 10, and you can then say that our 10 is included inside there. But because when I is 10 and that condition is then false, it then comes out of our for loop. So this will continue to iterate while this condition here is true. If it then becomes false, our loop will stop going, our loop will stop looping. If we wanted to count down, we can say 10 here, and then we can say -1 instead. -1. And you can see that now this is now an infinite loop, which is something that you don't want to have. So when we say that, if we say instead of less than here, we say while I is equals to 10, and then I is greater than equals to, or greater than equals to 0, you can then see that now it's counted from 10 all the way to 0. So you can see that if you don't have a point where your code is going to break, it's going to have something called an infinite loop. That means it's going to keep on looping until you break out of that software that you're writing. So infinite loops are things that you want to avoid at all costs, because it's not good for your computing resources. So now this is how for loops work. We've done it from 1 to 10, and now we've counted from 10 to 0. So what about while loops? We can use while loops in the same way that we use the for loops now, but what happens is that in order to avoid this whole thing about infinite loops, we can then declare our variables outside the while loop. So we say let j equals to 0, and then we say while j is less than 10, I want you to console log the value j. And you can see that continues because I've not yet put my ending, and then here I'll say j equals to j plus 1. And in this case now, let me just take this out. In this case now, you can see that I don't have that infinite loop, and this will eventually become 10, and then it breaks out of there. So what have I done here? I have this let j equals to 0, and then I said while j is less than 10, console log the value of j, and then increase j by 1. So when j is 0 here, it is true that 0 is less than 10, and we'll come into our loop here, and then we'll console log the value of j. So j becomes 0, and so inside here we said j plus 1 is 1. We assign that value to j. J now becomes 1. We come back here. It is true that 1 is less than 10. We console log that. we increase it by 2, it comes here, it is true that 2 is less than 10, and then it keeps on doing the same thing until we get to 10. So if we say 10, it is not true that 10 is less than 10, and so therefore we're not going to enter into here, and so then it comes out of this loop. If we had equals to here, we have our 10 here, and that's true. Now let's do it the other way that we did it before, where we had our 10 here, and then we said while 10 is greater than equals to 0, we want you to subtract 1, which is what we had before, and you can see that now it's counting from 10 to 0. If we didn't want it to add the 0, we can just do it that way, and the 0 would not be there. Okay, so this is just how to use the while loops and the for loops. So how can we use this with our array that we've just created here? So in this case, where we said let me just take this console log out here. Let I equals to 0 again. We're starting from 0. And so our array, we've seen that our array has another property called while I is less than states, which is this array dot length, which gives us a number here. We want to console log the values inside our array. So if we console.log, and then we say states and square brackets to get the value, and then we put the index in there, and so that now gives us Abuja, Lagos, Jos, Enugu, and Kano. We can do the same thing in here as well. We just exchange the value of states. We just exchange I with j inside here, and then we obviously have to then put states.length here. If you just put like a trivial value here, like 10 for example, it's just going to get to a point and it's not going to have that index, and so it's going to just keep on saying, okay, what value are you trying to get? And that is going to keep on having undefined, which we do not want because we don't have that value in our state. So it makes more sense to have the length, or use the length of the array to be able to loop through the array. So if we go back, we've come back to this, and this is how this looks at the moment. All right, so successfully been able to look at if statements and then for loops, etc. And so now we have this quick assignment for you guys to kind of go through to try out writing this code by yourself. And then the next video is going to be talking about functions and objects.